Welcome to all the graduates and their families on this really beautiful summer day. I'm Joan Edwards. I'm a field biologist in the biology department here, and I have the great honor of introducing Betty Reid Soskin, who is one of our honorary degree candidates for Commencement 2022. 100 plus years, and the oldest National Park Service ranger ever. What can I say? Betty Reid Soskin was born in Detroit, Michigan in September of 1921. And when Betty was 3, her family moved back to New Orleans, the original family homelands. There they were part of a vibrant Creole Cajun community representing all the professions, teachers and dentists, hairdressers, a parallel community with all the needed services in the broader racially segregated New Orleans. When Betty was 6, the great floods of 1927 destroyed her home, and her family moved to Oakland, California, where Betty went to a predominantly white school, graduating from Castlemont High in 1938. As Betty puts it, options for Black women at the time were limited. 3, working in agriculture, being a domestic servant, or marrying well. And as Betty put it, I skipped the first, briefly took the second, and within a year or so, I'd taken the third choice, marrying Melvin Reed, a college graduate and a football star, who I think you were enamored of. But Betty, of course, went way beyond those 3 options in life. She has had multiple professions and roles, some traditional, a wife and mother of 4, to others less traditional, from office clerk for the Boilermaker Union, to co-founding the iconic Reid's Records, to community organizer, to author, to blogger, and to her most recent position as park ranger at Rosie the Riveter, World War II Homefront National Historic Park in Richmond, California. Betty has had the fortune to experience the great sweep of social and political movements of the 20th into the 21st centuries. And she has the great talent, finesse, courage, and grace to make a difference wherever she went, to impact how people viewed race, to provide access to jazz, blues, and gospel music through Reid's Records, to provide a more inclusive, accurate, and rich historical record for Rosie Riveter, World War II Homefront National Historic Park, and to share her lived experiences more permanently in her riveting autobiography, appropriately entitled Sign My Name to Freedom, published when Betty was a mere 96 years old.
Yes.
Today, we are honored to have her here to give you directly a taste of her lived experiences and how they've shaped her life, in turn shaped the lives of many others, ours included. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you.
I have some questions for Betty, but Betty, you should feel free to take this wherever you would like. But I thought, given this is graduation and there are many families here, including many grandmothers, I thought we would start by asking Betty about her great-great-grandmother, Leontine Bro Allen.
Yes.
Can you tell us about her and her influence on you?
Yes, she was born into slavery in 1846. She was enslaved until she was 19. And she, at that time, was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation and came out marrying George Allen. They lived together, I don't know how many years, but produced 13 children.
Oh my goodness.
And my mother was born in 1894 and lived to be 102. I was born in 1921, and I'm still here.
Yay. But your grandmother, if I recall from your autobiography, she played a critical role in the community. Your great-great-grandmother.
Yes.
And she was, did she assist with the doctor, the visiting doctor?
I guess she would be considered an orderly, an intern. He would come through about every 3 months on horseback. And before he would come through, she would go out on her horse and would drape over the gateposts white shawls, which is where he was to stop. After he had visited with the sick, they would confer, and he would go on for another 3 months. So I guess she delivered all of the babies.
My goodness.
She was the midwife. I don't know what she would be now, or whether the babies were white or black. I don't know.
But she was the caregiver for the community.
She was the caregiver for the community.
Yeah, which is really lovely.
Uh-huh.
And you've sort of taken on that mantle, I feel, being caregiver for the community.
I think that's true, but I don't think it was true until a little while ago.
I wonder, you know, your family was based in New Orleans, but you were born in Detroit.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how that came about. Why were you in Detroit?
My father, whose father was a great builder in New Orleans, he built the first baseball park, which is the source of my pride. He built hotels. He built Corpus Christi Church in the 9th Ward. He built Corpus Christi High School. He built the first convent for the order of black nuns, who was the first in this country. He was very well known. He came in to his office one day, and a man walked in off the street, a white man, and said to him something, whatever he was charged with. And he used my father's first name. At that time, white people were only greeted by their last names. Black people were all by their first names. My father, who was a very proud Creole man, decided in that moment that that was not proper. And he addressed the white man by his first name and asked him if he realized who he was speaking to. That day, the family had put together what they could and sent my father, his wife, and her children. There was only one child. And I was the second, but I was not born yet. On the train to Detroit, where we lived for another 4 years until I was born. And my family was called back to New Orleans because my father was dying.
Mm. So you moved back to New Orleans.
We moved back to New Orleans.
But then came the New Orleans floods of 1927, and it washed out your home.
Yes.
And you had to leave. Can you tell us about those floods?
That was something I didn't really know about until I was grown up.
Yeah.
It was the flood of 1927, and the city fathers in New Orleans were going to save St. Charles Avenue in the Garden District. And they ordered the bombing of New Orleans in order to keep that.
So they sacrificed your neighborhood for...
The 7th and 9th wards
7th and
were
9th.
sacrificed.
And were those predominantly...
Those were predominantly black.
Black communities?
Uh-huh.
And your house was flooded
Yes.
out? And so you moved to California, which maybe was a good thing for
We came
us.
to California because my mother's father was already living here.
And so you grew up in California mostly, because you were only 6 when you left New
Yes.
Orleans. And you went to Castlemont High School in Oakland, California. And
Yes.
when you graduated, I mentioned some of your options, but maybe you should tell us in your own words what your options were when you graduated from Castlemont High.
When I graduated from Castlemont, there were only about a dozen black kids graduating in the class. Now the school is 99% black.
Wow.
But the chances for employment at that time would have been you'll have to help me.
Yes, you were saying there were only 3 options. I put it in my introduction, agriculture,
Yes.
which I think you completely rejected.
Yes.
Domestic work,
Yes.
which you tried for a week,
Yes.
I think, right? I don't know how long you tried it, but you didn't try it that long. And then you opted for marriage.
Yes, that marrying well was absolutely the thing to do.
And tell us about Melvin Reid, your first husband.
Oh,
Yeah.
Melvin Reid was the town clown. He was handsome, movie star, handsome. And he chose me. He was at that time playing baseball with the Negro Leagues. He wound up playing football. He was the star halfback for San Francisco. He wound up just before the formation of the major leagues. And he wound up playing for the Oakland Giants, the Honolulu Warriors.
Wow.
And then he retired.
But one of your first homes after you got married was on Sacramento Street or Avenue in Berkeley, California. And it happened that there was the Santa Fe Railroad went parallel to your
Santa Fe ran straight down our street.
And you were able to watch firsthand the Great Migration.
Yes.
And bringing in of the shipyard workers from the South.
Yes.
So tell us a little about that. That just seemed amazing to me.
I was 20, Mel was 23. And we had no idea about racial prejudice. No, that's not true. We knew about it, but we were not subject to it.
But you watched those trainloads of people, tens of thousands.
There were thousands and thousands of people who came in all day and all night. We would sit on our front steps and watch the trains go by.
Yes.
And it was as if we were greeting people as they came in. The trains were carrying black people and white people and orange people and every kind of person you want to see. And the character of Oakland was changing overnight. Over the coming years, the city changed so many times that it was hard to recognize. It was as if we had lived in several states without ever leaving home.
It was changing around you. I remember in one part you said Richmond went from 23,000 and grew to by 110,000 people. It just expanded.
Kaiser had built 4 shipyards in Richmond. And in those 4 shipyards, into a city with 28,000 people, he had brought in a workforce of 98,000 people.
Wow.
If you can imagine that. I didn't ever see those people because where I worked, that little union hall was in the center of town. And only a few miles away were the shipyards, 4 of them. And people were coming in to work every day and every night on 3 shifts a day. They were sleeping in chicken coops. Mm. They would buy tickets to the theaters and sleep in the seats all night. It was just an imaginary thing. But I never did know that they were there or that the ships were even being built, because where I was so far away. I never saw a ship being built, though there were 747 of them built in Kaiser's, under Kaiser's range.
But you worked for the Boilermaker.
I worked for the Boilermakers Union.
A36.
And I was making out cards that were giving changes of addresses. And I never knew what those cards were. I never did see a ship being built. I never saw a ship being launched. And still, some years later, when I was 85, I was asked to join the Rosie, the Riveter movement. And I didn't know what that was about.
But in the union that you worked in, it was a segregated union. Boilermakers A36 was an auxiliary.
Yes.
And it was the union only for blacks. It was a
Yes.
segregated union.
Yes.
And so you just signed in the black workers, but
Yes.
not the white workers.
No, we never did sign in anyone except for the black workers.
And I think in your autobiography, you also said you thought all the ships were built by blacks.
Yes.
Because you didn't ever see
No.
any white workers.
No, I never
which
did
I
see
thought
any.
was really interesting. After the war, your family moved to Walnut Creek.
Yes.
And your husband, Mel, and 3 of your 4 children, because the 4th one wasn't born yet, bought a lot and built a house in Walnut Creek and were the first black family in that neighborhood.
Yes, we were.
Tell us about it.
Well, we didn't really understand that we wouldn't be welcome there because we had never had trouble living anywhere. We had preceded segregation. It came with the Second World War.
Interesting.
So that we really didn't realize once they knew we were there that we wouldn't be welcomed.
And were you welcomed?
We had 5 years of death threats.
Mm-hmm.
And it was pretty awful because my husband, as all of the husbands in the suburbs had gone in, would leave the suburbs and go into the city to work and come back after midnight and come back and would leave in the morning. I didn't know what it was to have a husband. I didn't even know what it was to not be wanted. But I learned.
And you dealt with it somehow. You dealt with living in this community.
Yes.
Where there were people against you, the improvement committee, which sounds horrific, actually.
Yes. Improvement associations. Yes.
Improvement association, yes. But you also had allies. Or
Yes.
did you? Yes.
It was as if the white people who objected to my being there were one side, but there was another side. There were the people who were willing for us to be there. And they moved toward us, just as the others were moving away.
Great.
So that when the first time after I had begun to feel welcome and to feel as if I could belong, I read in the paper of a young black couple coming in. The woman was pregnant. and he was the truck driver. And they were coming in, and they're buying a house in a subdivision. And I thought that they didn't know that it was going to be all right. And I wrote a letter to the newspaper and explained that this was going to pass. It was going to be all right. A young lawyer who was on part of the part of the community that was going to welcome me called and said he didn't think I should do that. And I said, yes, I will. Of course I can do that.
Yeah.
Because they don't say those things when we're in the room. They only say them behind our backs.
Yeah.
And I will go and I will say what I have to say, and then I will get up and I will leave. And he said, but that's not the way it goes, Betty. And that evening, I went out to the school where the meeting was being held. And I sat in the middle row. And I'd been careful to dress well. And I began to hear all those things which people say when you're not around, because they didn't recognize that I was one of the undesirables that they were talking about. And when someone got up and said, if we can't deal with these people and keep them out based upon the diseases they bring in, and it was that point that I couldn't stand it anymore. I got up, I walked the length of the auditorium, and I stood in front of them, and I talked for 10 minutes and told them that it was all going to be all right. And then I got in the middle of it, and I got panicked, and I ran out. And I got to my car, and it had become dark while I was in the room. And when I got there, there was a newspaper man who wanted to know what my name was. And I told him, and he said he was going to go back in and see what happened as a result of what I had said. And then behind him was David Wharton, who had been the attorney whom I met then, who said that he was a member of the Unitarian Church. And I had been Catholic up to then. But I became a Unitarian.
I know that you said in your autobiography you spent a lot of time in Walnut Creek explaining Black lives to white people and white lives to Black people. You were a go-between of sorts.
Yeah.
But what you just told us was really a beautiful story, shocking but beautiful in terms of you spoke up, which is huge.
Yes, I began to speak up. the way I had never spoken up before. Because I was the only person in the room who could. And I spoke up all the way through the Panthers and began to raise money for the Panthers. I met so many people. And I think I grew up at that point.
I wonder if we can spend some time on your role in helping us to shape history. And there's a recurrent theme in your autobiography where you talk about what gets remembered in history is a function of who is in the room doing the remembering. I think you say this several times in your autobiography. And your impact on history is largely because you did come to the room and you brought your own lived experience into that room. And I wonder if you can tell us about the first time that you had a meeting, you went to a planning meeting for the new national park, the Rosie Riveter Park that they were planning. And you came as a representative for, a field representative for an assembly person in the California legislature.
Yes.
Tell us about this.
I had been found myself in lots and lots of roles. And I say found myself. It's true, I don't think I have ever looked for a job. I don't think I had my first job until I was 50. And at the time that I was working in the store, our family had developed
The Reid's Records?
Yes.
Oh, tell us about that. I skipped over that, so please, that's a wonderful story.
Yeah, we had found that when black folks came in from the South, they brought their culture with them. We didn't have any culture. And it was such that they couldn't get their music. We hadn't heard, we heard Duke Ellington and Jimmy Lunsford and all the great jazz people, but we'd never heard the blues. And we began to import them. And Mel became more and more involved. He was playing football, and I was taking care of our business. And that went on until I began to have children, and we moved out to the suburbs. And then he had remained in the city, and I had gone out to where life was pretty rough.
But Reid's Records continued, yes?
Reid's Records went on consuming him.
Yeah.
And he became a great promoter, he began to import lots and lots of black gospel music.
Yes.
And we were becoming more and more separate.
But you started that business together. I think you sold records out of your garage, is that right, to start with?
We owned a little duplex in Berkeley, and we cut out the wall of the garage, and we set up a little store. And we had our records in orange crates, and our money in the cigar box, and the money that the shop took in was in our Bendix washing machine.
But you provided a source that the
But
African
I never
community
dreamed
didn't have.
that I was running a store.
But you were.
Yes,
You were.
yes, I was.
So that was critical because you provided for
Yes.
the African community, the blues, the jazz, and then you added on top of that the gospel
Yes.
music, which was really fantastic.
And we eventually put a building up. Mill built a building, and that's the store.
And that store lasted until 2019?
75 years.
75 years.
Yeah.
Really amazing.
Yes.
And it was really sort of online streaming that might have stopped it, right? I mean, people weren't buying CDs and records
No.
by the time 2019 came along. So I want to go back to Rosie Riveter and your first meeting. You went to a meeting with a planning meeting where you were a representative. You weren't there because you'd actually experienced the home front, World War II home front. You were there as a field rep.
I was there.
And you were listening very carefully.
Absolutely.
And what did you hear?
Yes. I was there because I was working for the state of California.
Exactly, yeah.
I was not there because I was working to take care of anything that the park was going.
Exactly.
It was one of the meetings that I was attending for Dion. But as all of the planners who gathered there, trying to decide what shape this park was going to take, I was there being sure that there were going to be, that the park was going to deal with all of the home front, not that it was going to be an homage to the women. I was going to see that it was going to taking care of the 110,000 Japanese who were confined for up to 4 years and lost everything. Or the huge explosion that cost 320 lives, 202 of them being black. And there were 2 Kaiser ships that went up. And I hadn't realized until I was there. And I hadn't realized that those men were not the men that people were talking about, but they were the boys that had gathered at San Pablo Park when my husband had been playground director.
Betty, this is the Port Chicago explosion.
That was such an explosion, and there were 320 lives lost. There were so many stories, so many. And I was the only one in the room who knew about them. That was what made me so special. I hadn't realized until I realized they were coming apart.
They missed, at the first planning meeting, they missed so much of what had happened to so many people. They just had blinders on for what they were seeing, and you expanded their view in really amazing ways. Including in the Port Chicago explosion, you said there were 202 very young African American sailors who died.
They weren't even old enough to have left anyone.
Exactly.
When I walked into that room at one of the memorial services that the park gave every year on July 17th, there were 4 rows of people, of seats that were set aside for those people who needed to remember them. And they all began to stand up and to testify. And they would speak and they would talk about how the walls were pushed in on the theaters. And I realized that if I didn't speak up, the war would go down as being a white man's war. And they would be forgotten. And have not been forgotten.
And you became a surrogate for their would-be survivors, had they left any.
Yes.
Yeah, which was really beautiful. I wonder if we can turn to women in World War II, because I think all of us have a typical image of Rosie Riveter from that, Washington, from the Post magazine cover, Rosie Riveter like this.
Yes.
And I think you really make clearly that image is not the whole story.
No.
Can you fill us in a little bit more?
No. There are women in Richmond who had been working to get the park. And they wanted the park because Rosie the River had never been noticed. And they felt that that was something that needed to be taken care of. And I knew that was not what the Second World War was about. I knew that Henry Kaiser had built 747 ships in that time. I hadn't known when I was 20, but I certainly knew when I was 50 that was true.
Yeah.
And it paid, because I have made a career after the fact of being sure that all of those stories were told.
Yeah.
And they are told.
You have made
And my fingerprints are all over the park.
Which is wonderful. And I wonder if, you are working in a national, or you just retired this past March, yes?
Yes.
At the age of 100, which is pretty impressive. But you work, I think a lot of us think of national parks as being, wilderness national parks, or Yosemite or Yellowstone. But I wonder if what is your thought on the historic parks, the national historic parks, and their role? I think you have
The park came into being at a time when it was right for it to be so.
Absolutely.
Because it came in when so much history was being made. Loving in their marriage.
Yes.
So many things were happening that the fact that the Japanese were finally able, it wasn't that they didn't want to know. It's that they didn't want to burden their children.
Yes.
But their children came up and were ready.
They wanted to know.
Yes, they wanted to know.
Yeah. And you were saying earlier when we were talking that you felt these national historic monuments actually have become our history in
Yes.
so many ways, and
Yes.
play just a really critical role.
Yes, and now there is a national director in the parks who is the national Indian, whose time has come.
Fantastic.
And
Wonderful.
she's going to see to it that those children who were taken away from their children, their parents, so early in life, are now rewarded.
Yeah, they should be.
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yes.
Fantastic. I'm going to end with a question, because we have, young people out here, and you have this broad sweep of history. I wonder if you feel that we have made progress over your lifetime. Do you think?
Oh, yes.
Are we going the right direction?
Yes. I don't know if we have as much time left as we need. I just don't know, because I don't know what my life is going to be like. I just don't know, but I do know that it's always been the questions. It's the questions that have always brought progress, and the answers always stop it. And I am so grateful to be living into a time and to feel that I am going on asking questions.
It's fantastic. And is that your advice to young people going
Yes.
forward?
Yes. Yes.
Ask questions, everybody.
Yes.
and see them through to resolution, which is what Betty has done her whole life, which is pretty amazing. So, is there anything more you want to add to?
No, I don't feel like I've said all I need to say.
Well, there's a lot more you could say. I mean, there's a whole book.
There's a whole 98 years
Yes.
that's going to go unsaid.
But you've been fantastic. Let's thank Betty for coming and being here and being a wonderful